Hello everyone and welcome back. Today's chapter, we're going to cover interest groups and lobbying. Now, when we think about interest groups, we can think of interest groups represented by the people in this picture. Here we see an environmental interest group who are concerned with fracking happening in the country. Fracking is a way to get oil out of the natural ground. But when we think of this group or this next group pictured, teachers' unions on strike, you can see that when people band together in group, they are united in their common interests. They can try to attempt to influence political outcomes. We can recognize this in Black Lives Matter. We can recognize this in the NRA, the AARP, and more. So what do all of these groups have in common? For that, we should understand the character of interest groups. So to define an interest group, we should recognize that these are organizations that try to influence government's programs and policies. Interest groups are looking to affect what the government is putting out, whether it's specific programs, policies such as tax policies, and more. We can see interest groups have a vested interest in these political outcomes. And when it comes to interest groups and the founders held that people in a free society would organize to pursue their own self-interest. The founders thought that people had interests and that they should be free to pursue those interests. They recognized that government restrictions on organized interests would also be a suppression of liberty. And so in our First Amendment right, the freedom to assemble, we also recognize the freedom of association. You can meet with like-minded people if you so desire without fear of government intervention. Not only are these interest groups allowed to participate in the political process, it is recognized that these groups are somewhat inevitable. And that takes us to the idea of pluralism. James Madison, author of key Federalist Papers back in the late 1700s, he argued that good government encourages multitudes of interests. But when he was talking about them, he called them factions. And he said these factions were groups of people concerned about their own economic and special interests. You can think of business owners at the time, farmers, laborers, merchants. Madison argued that the multitude of interests, if you just let all of them compete, it will prevent any one singular interest from dominating the others. This was important. Remember, going back to the 1700s, the founders of this country, they were concerned with centralization, that some force would become too powerful and therefore abuse their power. Understanding pluralism and Madison's idea behind it, he argues that if you allow multiple interest groups, if you allow every interest group to compete, it will kind of balance each other out. So this is known as pluralism. It's the idea of having multiple voices, multiple groups, all competing for the best idea possible. And so Madison's principle, pluralism, it's the theory that all interests should be free to compete for influence in the government. Now, could you imagine if we didn't have this freedom, if groups were denied their ability to unite? Think of what would happen to those teachers' unions, or special interest groups, maybe ideological goals, business groups, political parties, and more. It would radically change the way we encounter politics, and therefore we should understand what role, at least for Madison, they would have. He argued that since everyone is free to compete for this influence, it will have to lead to outcomes that result in compromise and moderation. People will give up a little bit of everything they wanted so they can get some of what they want. And they will recognize that they can strengthen their support by opening up to wider audiences. Let's clarify it a little bit. Interest groups, you may have also heard of these groups referred to as lobbies, special interests, or even pressure groups. Now, interest groups are sometimes confused with political action committees. Political action committees are typically they are created by these interest groups. So let's use a very famous interest group, the NRA, the National Rifle Association. The NRA may have created a political action committee or PAC. This is basically the money-giving arm of interest groups. So when you ever hear about an interest group giving money to a candidate or to multiple candidates or parties, this money is coming from those PACs, the political action committees, and many are created by these interest groups. Now, interest groups are different from political parties. We recognize that political parties like the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, and more, all of these parties have an interest in winning the election. However, interest groups, what separates them is they are concerned with policies. Parties organize to win elected office. Interest groups are willing to work with whoever is in power. Interest groups can see the benefit of working together with Democratic politicians and Republican politicians in the hopes that both whoever is in power will create policies that these interest groups are aligned with. So we should understand just the role that they're willing to play. Interest groups will give money quite frequently to political candidates and parties of all sorts of parts of the political spectrum. It's something to consider. So there are many types of interest groups. Let's go over a few. There are corporate interest groups or economic interest groups such as AT&T, Comcast, Exxon, which is responsible for producing oil. We have labor groups, which like the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters Union, professional associations like the American Bar Association for attorneys. There are citizen or public interest groups like Common Cause, which try to expand democratic efforts across the country. Ideological groups like the Christian Coalition, and public sector groups, these are for officials in government like the National Governors Association. Using these interest groups as a springboard to unite their effort and to target their energy, we see that these groups, widely different, coming from all different sorts of life, but all try to influence politicians to make policies that they are in agreement with. Now, whenever we think of interest groups, we should recognize that interest groups are all about representation, and groups want to be represented by government. However, there is one critique with interest groups, with Madison's idea of pluralism, and that's unequal representation. For example, there may be charitable groups, interest groups that have an interest in supporting the homeless or the poor, but the homeless themselves have some challenges in uniting and organizing together. There is no national network for homeless individuals, and therefore we see that interest groups who are trying to pursue these things are typically comprised of wealthier individuals. And so we should recognize that one of the major critiques of pluralism is that it has an upper class bias. That the interest groups, even though every group is free to compete to influence government power, we can see that there are some interest groups that have means. Many have the organizational capacity and the money to support these groups' interests. Let's go to a quote from E.E. Schatzsnyder. He is a political scientist. That's hard to say. I apologize. But the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with an upper class accent. And what he is trying to bring to the table is to recognize, to highlight that groups typically form around the interests of those of means. We can look at data to show that he's not too far from the truth. Individuals are more likely to join a group if their income level is higher, if they have higher levels of education, or are part of a professional occupation, like an attorney or doctor of some sort. So when people band together to form these interest groups, we can look at what do these groups have in common, at least organizationally. When we think about the components that are needed to create and support interest groups, you need to think about where are they getting their source of money, their financial structure of the group. Keep in mind, operating a large group is expensive. It is expensive because there are people at the top who we trust, if you're a part of this interest group, to be the leadership, to make the decisions. You need money to go and help aid and assist these various endeavors. Many cases, the larger you become, you may need an organized office space. You may need your members to actually be hired full-time staff. If your interest group is formed around an idea that requires full-time workers, think of many cancer charitable organizations. They have an organized structure of leadership, money, offices, and members. And so we can recognize that that is very costly. So how are these groups funded? Typically, it's in a number of forms like membership fees. You may pay money to join and be a part of an interest group, or dues like union dues that are taken out of your paycheck every month automatically. Interest groups also rely on voluntary donations and contributions from their supporters. Interest groups can also offer services that they can provide that are paid for by someone. So interest groups typically take the research from skilled professionals, and then they can sell that research out for money to help continue to support their efforts. And so we recognize that these services like research reports, presentations, or data that's gathered by this interest group, it is somewhat of a commodity that can be bought and sold. Finally, interest groups are funded by advertising in their publications and on their websites. You may have seen an interest group before and didn't know it, but they may have had a donate now button or something like that. You can imagine that there are many groups who seek this financial support. Now, in political science terminology, there is a problem with large interest groups, and it's known as the free rider dilemma or the free rider problem. So what are free riders when it comes to an interest group? Well, it's basically recognizing that there are many benefits that are needed in order to avoid the free rider problem. So think of a problem. Think of, let's use in California in the 1980s and 90s, the problem of pollution. In California, we had a wildly massive smog problem in which the air around the cities was very brownish, grayish. It was unhealthy to breathe in. And there were interest groups that were united in trying to fight this pollution. However, keep in mind, if that interest group that's fighting pollution, if they get their way by the government, okay, that benefit will not be available just to those who participated. That benefit would be available for everyone in California. We can see that since these interest groups rallied and have these petitions to get governors and other legislators smog on the minds of those individuals, we can think of how, as a result, thanks to California's smog checks and smog testing facilities, we can actually reduce the emissions from our vehicles. So something like clean air or national security or healthcare, there are some things that are known as collective goods. Collective goods present some problems for groups. Collective goods are available by definition to everyone. So think of clean air. You cannot exclude anyone from having clean air. If one group gets clean air done and we have cleaner air as a result, everyone benefits, yet only a few people did the work. There is a strong temptation for people to be free riders. They may think to themselves, either consciously or subconsciously, oh, that's someone else's problem. Someone else will come along and do it. That is the core dilemma behind the free rider problem. Think of your own study groups. You may have been assigned, not in this class, but you may have been assigned in previous classes, a group project of sorts. Have you ever been that person who worked the hardest on your group project, or have you ever been that person who worked the least? And yet, in a group project, everyone earns the same grade, most of the time. And when we think about your group project in your class, or a bigger issue like the pollution in the air, we can see how some people will say, well, someone else is already working on it, so it'll get done. I can just hide out and not be involved. This is a problem that interest groups need to overcome. Interest groups that help defeat pollution benefit everyone, and whether everyone joins the group or not. And so interest groups have to make an effort to emphasize why people should join groups. So why join a group in the first place? How do groups overcome this free rider problem, this free rider dilemma? And to think about it, we should recognize that groups offer selective benefits. Selective benefits are available to group members only. Keep in mind, these are different from those collective benefits which are available to everyone. And so selective benefits come in many forms. There are informational benefits. If you join an interest group, you may be a recipient of a newsletter program. You may be asked to go to some conferences to learn more. You may receive material benefits such as special goods, services, money even, in the form of a lottery system or some grand prize. You can think of the AARP, for example. They have become very skilled at offering senior discounts at many restaurants. And they recognize this power brings a lot of support to the AARP. Many more members will become used to thinking about the AARP and want to participate in their causes. When people participate, it also leads to solidarity benefits. When we think of people joining these groups, they are of shared interests. And whenever you have something in common with someone, this can lead to friendship. This can lead to networking in professional life or socializing of some form. And finally, anyone who joins in interest groups, it's hard to recognize that anyone who has this passionate interest, they are receiving a purposive benefit. They get the good feeling that comes with pursuing a goal or serving a cause. So I raised the idea of the AARP. Fun fact, my father recently received his AARP card in the mail. Now he's in his early 50s, and he was at first hesitant. He didn't like the idea of being closer to retirement age. The AARP pursues interests for the elderly. However, after showing his AARP membership card around at these various restaurants and recognizing he could get some of those material benefits like discounts, he became an avid supporter. And so you can use the example of the AARP, this group that forms around the interests of elderly people. They try to push for things like lower retirement plan taxes, lower costs for prescription drugs, more affordable health care. The AARP is constantly trying to push politicians to help and assist the elderly. So they offer informational selective benefits. They often produce a magazine or newsletter which they can deliver to people, typically senior citizens, and this can provide information on issues affecting these seniors. The AARP also offers material selective benefits. You can get insurance at a low cost to you. You can also get low interest credit cards as a result of being a member. There are many benefits. Then we have to think of the purposive selective benefits as well. We recognize that members may become more involved politically. They may, in the past, have started what's called a telephone tree, where one person calls three people. Those three people each call three people. And after a few phone calls, after a few levels down the road, you've contacted hundreds of thousands. Now we can look at the AARP. They published this magazine. Here's Steve Martin on the cover. It says, "Looking Sharp." And we can see that they're trying to tap into ways to help elderly individuals. This magazine provides awareness of the issues that are important to the members, the leadership of the AARP, and then they can use this to draw in support in the form of donations to help lobby other groups. So how do interest groups like the AARP, like the NRA, like the American Bar Association, how do they influence members of Congress? And that's what lobbying is all about. Interest groups do not try, they do try to influence members of Congress. Lobbying is an attempt by a group to influence the policy process through the persuasion of public officials. Lobbying, in many respects, it originates from the 1800s. It's an old term. A president was staying at a hotel of some sort, and then a very powerful business member, he stayed in the lobby. He waited in the lobby until he could get that face-to-face audience. And so the name has stuck. We see that these interest groups try to develop relationships with public officials, and they can do this through direct lobbying methods. We can think of face-to-face contact with legislators or top staff, members of a presidential administration. Think of a key advisor to the president and members of the bureaucracy. These direct lobbying methods also include information to legislators on key legislation. And so remember, they have a pool of experts at their disposal. They may try to use the research presented by those experts to help influence a member of Congress's decision. They can even have these expert witnesses called for testimony at the congressional committees. Now, lobbying is something that is somewhat controversial around the country because we should recognize that there is a lot of money involved when it comes to interest group spending. We can look at data from just a few years ago, from 2011 to 2015, by major groups. So take the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is an organized group of different businesses with an interest in creating business-friendly policies. Look at how much they have spent in various years. In 2011, they spent $66 million. And then in 2012, they spent $136 million. What's the major difference? 2012 was a presidential election year. We see that in presidential election years, or in other election years, like the midterm elections that took place in 2014, we see these interest groups raising the bar, so to speak, on what they could try to attempt to get done. The American Medical Association, they spent upwards of $20 million at various years. General Electric, which produces a lot of goods, they spend millions of dollars. Here's the AARP, that group with the concerned interests of the elderly. They don't spend as much, but whatever they do spend, it is quite helpful. The NRA, often in the media spotlight, they have spent millions of dollars as well. And Human Rights Campaign has spent about $1 million in these period of 4 years. So whenever we think of interest groups, we can recognize, going back to the critique of pluralism, we see that there's a massive amount of money. And thanks to the innovation of super PACs, which were created in the 2010s, we see that groups now have the ability to raise more money than ever. Thanks to Citizens United, where the court recognized that money is a form of speech, and since speech is free in the United States, there should not be limitations on the amount of money people spend on political ideas. We should expect these numbers to grow and grow. Let's review. The best description of the ideal of pluralism is that A, the public good should always trump individual interests. B, interest groups should be free to compete for governmental influence. C, interest groups are factions that endanger liberty. Or D, democracy is best served by legalizing but regulating the influence of interest groups. Well, if we said B, that would be the correct answer. Remember, Madison argued that by having multiple interests compete with one another all the time, no one group will become too powerful. Now, does that work for you? Of course, that is up for critique, but that was Madison's theory, and that has been the tradition in the United States for centuries. Here is another review question. I briefly alluded to it in my words. It wasn't flashed on the PowerPoint slide, but interest groups are permitted to spend as much money as they want on issue advocacy during campaign season, as long as they A, do not employ any person who has formerly worked on a campaign, B, present both sides of the issue in their issue advocacy ads, C, are willing to publicize their membership lists, or D, do not coordinate their efforts with the candidate's own campaign organization. The answer is D. So you are allowed to create a super political action committee, a super PAC, as part of an interest group. And they can accept as many donations as possible, and they can spend as much as they are willing to spend. The only rule against it is that they cannot directly engage and organize with a candidate who's up for an election. So interest groups, they are the beneficiaries of many American policies, and we should recognize their power as we continue along in our discussion of American politics. That's it for the chapter on interest groups. I will see you again soon, or if this is coming at the end of your semester, we will see what this has in store for our exam. Take care, and I will hope to speak with you again soon.